Why? Okay, every time someone asks if I've talked about the Hasan stuff already, I'm just gonna wait a bit longer. Okay, that's what I'm gonna do. You don't deserve that shit. Fuck. Lornabox's subreddit is claiming that he was banned for being anti-Islam. Oh, Asmongold. Lornabox's subreddit is claiming Asmongold was banned for being anti-Islam. It's ridiculous. The guy endorsed the genocide of Palestinians. I'm not editorializing with genocide. That's the term he used, and he meant genocide. He said he didn't care. It's also, I don't even get it. It's like, it's not mutually exclusive. Like, you can be, he was being anti-Islam and also being kind of ambivalent about there being a genocide. He said he didn't care. Yeah. Which is really bad. I even said that anyway. Fuck. Whatever. Speaking of bad faith mischaracterizations as a tendency, Hasan has decided to call me out. Kind of. Oh no. It's always prompted by the same thing, you understand? Can you guess what? Can you guess what prompted this call out?
Lonerbox tried to disprove your material condition by pulling up a map of the LGBT equality index and a map of GDP per capita, which line up almost perfectly, but then pointed to the GDP of Gulf states and Russia to say material conditions are good there and is still homophobic.
Interesting. So they actually watched the stream. Okay.
What is this argument, dude? Like, why?
Yeah, what is this argument?
Why is Lonerbox trying to be like defend Asmongold? What a fucking take.
It's interesting that that disagreeing with Hasan is automatic defense of Asmongold. There's only one side or another. That's interesting. Okay. If you don't agree with my incredibly reductive, shit for brains, dogmatic view on homophobia in the world, it must be because you defend Asmongold. For the record, how many times yesterday did I say I said Asmongold was reprehensible in what he said and that he deserved his ban. That's what I actually said. And defend Asmongold. Anyway, what the fuck? Okay. Are we going to get any engagement? Oh, by the way, sorry. Sorry. Without remembering what he said after this, because I think this was as far as I got. Hasan doesn't actually think I'm defending Asmongold's take. Just so you guys understand that. He doesn't actually think I support Asmongold in his take about Palestinians. You're underestimating him when you say that. The actual thing with Hasan here is that he realizes that someone who I think he has respected the opinions of, at least in the past, disagrees with him on something and has challenged one of his positions. And Hasan is too insecure about his intelligence to actually look into what I'm actually saying. So he's thinking, what's the quickest way I can neutralize this threat to my perceived intelligence? Well, just say he's defending Asmongold. Oh, there we go. Damn, defending the genocider. Got him. That's it. It is very intentional. He does not actually think I defend Asmongold's take. He is cleverer than that. And he's also clever enough to know that he's too stupid to actually contend with what I'm saying. So he's not going to even, that's why he's not going to check. He's just going to go with that characterization by that chatter.
Like, I thought this guy was like somewhat normal. What has happened?
What has
happened? Yes, brother, you're right. There is spiritually something wrong with Muslim countries and Russia.
I also, again, if he'd bothered to check the source of that claim, he would know that I said the complete opposite of that. That I said that there's nothing in essential or in the DNA of Arabs and Muslims that makes their cultures homophobic. I even acknowledged that throughout history, there have been times when the Arab and Muslim world was more societally advanced in terms of not just views on minorities and everything else and treatment of minorities, but also more technologically advanced and intellectually advanced than the Christian world. Did that mean there was something spiritually wrong with the Christian world? No, it's because at the end of the day, societies are shaped by a large combination by a network of different influences, whether it's geography or environment, or it can even be down to like the weather in a lot of ways about shaping these cultures. And it can also be because of wars or geopolitics, or even just accidents. Even just like one leader can just go fucking mental, and that can shape the course of history in a lot of ways. There are lots of different reasons. As for the Middle East, I think it's very easy to explain how there are multiple variables, whether it's the drawing up of the borders post that region coming on the wrong end of the Ottoman Empire, the way that those borders were drawn very arbitrarily and by people who didn't really have the interests of the people in the region in mind, the fact that there were power grabs made by different factions, by different monarchs, like the fact that you had the Hashemites and the Ibn Saud family basically trying to take control over the Hijaz and those regions. You had like the opportunistic power grabs in Syria by Faisal, but then he got kicked out of Syria, and then he was installed in Iraq, and then he by the British Empire, and then he's overthrown in Iraq by a local leader who ends up supporting the Nazis. Like, yeah, it's complicated. Okay, there's a lot of reasons, and unfortunately, a lot of the Middle East has not really had enough time to shake off a lot of those old inherited like feudal tendencies of the Ottoman Empire, and that's why a lot of these countries are still very socially regressive. That's why a lot of them are still very authoritarian. That's why a lot of them are bad on women's rights. It's not as simple, however, like Hasan might mention, as it's just because of material conditions. Like it's just because they're poor or because of Western bombs. That is a very brain dead, reductive way to look at it. And again, this is the map I'm referring to, by the way. The ones that apparently match up perfectly. Really? You think these maps match up almost perfectly? Again, they match up almost perfectly if you're not interested in any other variable apart from what material conditions and America bad. But you can look, for example, the thing I said about Russia. Russia is, in terms of wealth, a lot better off than anywhere in Africa, especially Central Africa. But in terms of gay rights, it's actually almost just as bad as some of these places. It's worse than some. It's worse than some of the southern ones. Doesn't also mention that Latin America, these countries like Bolivia, not great for GDP per capita and all that, but for gay rights, like far better than anywhere in these areas. China does very well economically, okay, but not very good on gay rights. It's not very, like, there's just because there's some correlation, and even here in the Islamic world, you've got like a lot of very poor performing areas in Central Africa, economically and in terms of gay rights, but it seems like improved living standards for the locals, especially for like Emirati locals and Saudi locals, or people in Oman and all these like stable, like much more stable oil-rich Gulf states, they are about as bad as the really poor ones. Yeah, it's a bit more complex than just fucking American bombs and material conditions. Yes, that is a very, very easy claim to make. Sorry.
Okay. Also, material conditions in Russia being good is funny, but you know.
Yeah, it's a good thing I never said they were great. It's just that they're better than a lot of countries that have about the same performance on queer rights. Yes, that's actually quite valid. It's quite a valid take, Hasan. Sorry. It's not even to mention the stuff that Hasan was saying about the Middle East was so stupid. Trying to say that like people in Gaza, like Hamas, have homophobic tendencies and culturally regressive tendencies just because they don't have the breathing space allowed to them because they're too busy getting bombed by Americans. But even that, if you look at like the Middle East, that's even Middle Eastern tendencies on homosexuality and other like cultural progressive things is still it's not that simple at all. So
Hasan, hooray. What dumb take made him all today? Let's all go down to, see the straw man of you, he made from what his chatters say.
Thanks for the $49.99. That's incredibly generous, Tick Dickler. Oh, God damn it. Okay. Anyway, like if you look at some of these regions, you can just go through it, okay? Again, like you can go through some of these areas, and to try and reduce all of this to colonialism and wealth, it doesn't really mention the fact that in a lot of these cases, like when it came to Saudi Arabia, pretty well off, in terms of their local population, but not very good on. I think his answer to this was that, it's just because they've got Western-backed dictators. Western-backed dictators are the reason that Saudi Arabia is like regressive on sexuality. As if, are we really suggesting that local Saudis and Emiratis are yearning for fucking gay rights, like, but they can't do it just because of their leaders? Actually, no, that's not true. These countries in the Gulf states were, particularly Emirates, Saudi, and Oman, these countries were actually the ones that came out of the Arab Spring fairly well. They were stable throughout that period. The Arab Spring took off largely in places like Egypt and Libya and places that were actually led by secularists, even in places that were more anti-Western. Assad was anti-Western, okay? But the Arab Spring is still facing the fucking repercussions over there, right? Because there's still a civil war happening. And Assad was not pro-Western. He was put on the axis of evil by George Bush. He was a Iran-backed figure. What about Lebanon? Lebanon gets bombed by Israel all the fucking time. They've had like 4 invasions. They've been caught in between the imperial interests of America, of Iran, of Syria, of the French at one point. They've been caught in between all the bullshit, and not to mention internal sectarian violence, like civil wars, like incredibly bloody civil wars. But in Beirut, in the north and the east, that's where you've got your Beirut Pride, where you have gay clubs and gay events every year. So. But you compare that to somewhere like the Emirates or Saudi, which don't get bombed by Israel and do actually have a lot more breathing space, and you don't have gay pride events every year. So it's very reductive. It's very reductive to suggest what he was suggesting yesterday with Asmongold about American and Israeli bombs and material conditions. Also, material conditions in Lebanon are quite shit. Their economy's been fucked for ages. They've barely had a functioning government for most of the last 20 years. They were occupied by Syria for 29 years. They were occupied by Israel in the south for 18 years. They've had one of the worst inflation crises in the entire world. People can't even get into their bank accounts for extended periods. But they have actually made progress in some parts of the country on gay rights. So it's like, it's complicated, okay? It's also, by the way, it's reductive to put it all down to to Islam as well, because although the Islamic world right now is very culturally regressive and is authoritarian, et cetera, it's also that was never the case compared to the rest of the world. The Islamic world used to be more advanced on inclusion of minorities than the rest of the world for quite a while. Just saying, that's all. That's all I'm saying. Okay. And maybe that's what Hasan doesn't want to contend with, because you can't sum it up into a dogmatic soundbite as you're trying to re-radicalize your friend or radicalize your fucking 14-year-old dipshit audience. So yeah, sorry.
New, Israel could target a wide array of targets in Iran, including missile and drone storage sites, military bases, key government buildings, and nuclear research laboratories. 2 Israeli officials briefed on the plans, tell the New York Times. Nice. Why mention Lonerbox? I don't fucking know. I don't know how. No, bro, his brain broke over his hate for you. I didn't even know he hated me. Like, I've talked to him before. I think he's just more so like a Destiny orbiter.
Oh, and I don't hate him. I just dislike him massively because of his fucking conduct in the last year. But okay. One example of which we will get to in a moment.
The more you orbit, the more insane your takes.
Yeah, because you radicalize your audience to support the axis of resistance. People who, on top of terrorizing the fuck out of other Arabs, more so than any other group, by the way, they are also insanely regressive. They're massively anti-Semitic. They support senseless violence that doesn't actually improve the conditions of anyone that they claim to advocate for. And you glaze them and call them Anne Frank. That's a problem. Yes, that's a problem from the largest streamer on Twitch for politics. Yes.
Get, and you just, I don't know, you just like kind of lose sight of any sort of honesty.
Oh.
He just ruined his day saying that, man.
He says, after completely dishonestly representing my positions because of a chatter. Again, you know it's intentional as well, because I guess he's doing this because he knows that I'm more critical of him than he first thought I was. And now, do you remember last year, people would tell him that I was a phalangist or whatever the fuck else, and that I supported Sabra Shatila and all this shit. And he was like, I don't know, that's a bit like, come on, that's like, this is just telephone. This is bullshit. He dismissed it. He dismissed his chat because I guess he was on better terms with me. But now that that I guess he knows that I'm like friendly with Destiny and all the rest of it. It's like, now we're going to take chat at their word. And now we're going to say, oh, he disagrees with my position on material conditions being the sole
What's
cause
worse, mocking Anne Frank or Helen Keller?
Don't know. Thanks for the $20. But now because he doesn't like my positions as much, now we're just going to say that, oh, you must be defending Asmongold because you disagree with my takes on material conditions and homophobia.
Man, it's not even a crash out type of situation. Like it's just weird.
So by contrast, let's look at what he actually says when, because when I accuse Hasan of saying something or holding a position, I'll show you him doing it. So that's another contrast. Anyway. Okay.
By the way, just want to point out to LSF, to the LSF crowd, once again, I just saw this. Wonderful stuff. Asmongold and I have a 4-hour conversation. Hasan says the Houthi he talked to is like Anne Frank. First of all, he was not a fucking Houthi. Secondly,
to be clear, it is inconclusive whether or not he's actually a Houthi because his social media activity suggests he is, because he's literally told people that he's a soldier when asked, among other things. But then when Hasan asked him, he just said, "Oh yeah, I'm just a kid from Yemen." And Hasan actually even said, "Oh, I think he's media trained," with that question, with that answer. So the jury is out on whether or not he's actually a Houthi. So it is completely 100% confirmed that he's a Houthi sympathizer. He supports them, and he makes videos supporting them. So, okay.
yes, he withstood genocide. That is correct. Like, you can't fucking materialize a appropriate dwarfy or whatever the fuck this Destiny Dick Rider account is. But 4 hours of conversation.
He's doubling down on comparing the Houthi kid to Anne Frank. Okay.
That's the one thing you got? That's awesome. That is fucking dope, dude. LSF is so insane. Anne Frank was just like Luffy. Is this the really best that Twitch politics has to offer? These two idiots, embarrassing. The guy was a part of a terrorist organization who beats women for going to school and execute gay men on a weekly basis, and Hasan invited bombos.
Oh,
yeah,
no.
that guy literally got detained by the fucking Houthis, by the way. Check OP's history. I don't need to check it. But again, 4-hour conversation. 4-hour conversation. Is Destiny still interested in doing World War I research? Little fucking hermits, dude.
Has Hasan ever actually elaborated to any degree on what's happening in Yemen with the Houthis? The Anne Frank comparison is actually so disgusting. Yeah, when you know anything about the Houthis, it is pretty fucking gross to compare a supporter of the Houthis to Anne Frank. Yeah.
Oh my God. Get a life. Get a grip. Get a fucking grip, you animals. Holy shit. Also, everything else is deemed political for LSF. Meanwhile, this is like,
Wow.
This is fine.
Is he really upset that that's the clip that got taken from the stream? Yeah, sorry. If you insert a banger, people are going to post the banger. The banger is you calling them out. No one cares about your material analysis of homosexuality, which is just every country that's homophobic is only so because they got bombed by America or Israel, or when they're not bombed by Israel and America, it's because America supports their leaders. Okay. Don't worry about that.
So fucking annoying. I wonder why the subreddit is dying. Exactly. Like, what do you think? You can put like normal shit that's going on a day-to-day basis on...
There are clips on LSF calling out Asmongold as well. Yeah, he doesn't care. He doesn't care.
Fucking Twitch, just... If you do this kind of thing, you're going to turn it back into fucking Stormfront again. And it's...
Wow. I love the Marxist-Leninist reasoning. It always comes back to you must be a Nazi if you don't hold my... if you think my Houthi glazing is funny. Okay. Has Hassan ever spoken about what the Houthis actually do in Yemen? Like where they came from, what they believe, what their conduct is, uh, about the war with Saudi Arabia, about the famine? Does he ever actually talk about any of this? I've only ever heard American Saudi bombs and resistance to Israel, just like 1,000 miles away from Yemen. But we've done the history of Yemen once on stream. I guess we could do a summary. Do you guys want to know why because maybe people don't actually explain necessarily why the Houthis are bad, like why people have a problem with them. Okay, let's maybe just do a little summary. So a little summary of Yemen. Okay. The problem is that Yemen has been divided along ethnic and tribal and sectarian lines for quite a long time. It's kind of exceptional to the degree of how divided it is, largely because of terrain and the fact that in these kind of like more hilly areas up here compared to the coastal areas, there's not really been the perfect environment for interaction between other groups. And it's also caught in a very important trade route with East Africa and the Red Sea and this little bit here. So it's been the subject of imperial interest, whether it's from the Ottoman Empire or from the UK or France or whatever else. Like it's not it's not a very good spawn point historically, okay? It's always had instability on kind of similar lines in a lot of ways. The Ottomans used to see their part of Yemen that they occupied, because its borders changed a lot. The Ottomans used to see that as as the most unwanted area to govern. So when there were prospective Ottoman governors, if they had any choice, they would never go to Yemen. Like they would always choose to administer some other part of the world. So that meant that the most incompetent, most corrupt people who had no choice would be the ones governing Yemen. They would be the ones there, and they would constantly lose control over particular areas. Then they would get kicked out, and then they would use a military force to come back in. There was one part of Yemen, I think, that was literally conquered 20 times in the space of 10 years during the Islamic conquest, during like 900 AD. It was like, it was Sana'a, the capital. It was conquered like 20 times between 904 and 913 AD. By rivaling factions. It's a really, really unstable region. And you can even look in recent history, post-Ottoman Empire, you can look at some of the maps of old Yemeni jurisdiction, 1923, this is 1940s, when there was North and South Yemen. They're very similar to actually the map of tension you see right now. See that? This kind of like northwestern part is generally distinct from the more like the southern part, because again, like Ottomans used to have more control up here, the British used to have more control along Aden and the coast, and that is largely based on ethnic divides. You've got the population up here, which is part of a sect of Shia Islam called the Zaydis. Zaydi? I can't remember how to pronounce it. And the rest of the country is like Sunni, and has been more like the interest point of Gulf states and places like at one point the United Kingdom. At other points like Al Qaeda have had interests in those areas. But in any case, the Houthis, who the fuck are they? Okay, the Houthis are a family, a pretty well-to-do family, a pretty like prominent family from around this area of Yemen, who are descended from a group that once actually controlled the entire place. Or they're from the same sect. So that same sect of Shias in Yemen used to actually control all this a few hundred years ago. And in the 1900s, there was there were some attempts to try and restore as much of this as possible. And in the 20s and 30s, they fought with the Saudis. They've fought between the north and south over these areas. At one point, Yemen was actually partitioned. It was partitioned into north and south, where one side was backed by the Soviets. The other side was at one point there was backing from Nasser in Egypt. No, not Yazidi, Zaidi. Not Yazidi. Yazidi are very different. Okay, they don't even sound similar. Fuck you. Anyway, sorry. Yemen eventually unifies in the 1990s. Its border with Saudi Arabia is not actually, I don't think, fully cemented until somewhere like the year 2000 with the Treaty of Jeddah. But the problem with Yemen trying to unify these very historically divided and sectarian areas is that the only way to really do it was through an iron fist. So you have, like a lot of these other countries, you've got dictatorships. The guy was called Saleh. He was the leader for quite a long time. And even during this unified Yemen from the 90s onwards, you had a Shia insurgency that started in about 2004. So within this area, you had a guy called Hussein al-Houthi, who was the head of the Zaidi Shia sect, who started to have issues with the official government of Yemen. Their issues were in part to do with corruption. Their issues were with secularization. There was some to do with wealth divides and the idea that the government was more preferable to the south. There were also very, very big issues with the country's approach to Israel. They had very, very big issues with the fact that the country was not fighting with Israel enough, that they were too conciliatory. So, even in the early days, he would publish these sermons and texts that were very, very praising of the regime in Iran, very, very praising of Hassan Nasrallah. They actually name him quite a lot. And he was very inspired by Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah's attacks on Israel, like their resistance to Israeli occupation. And when Hezbollah drove Israel out of the south of Lebanon, this was seen as a kind of like rallying call for al-Houthi, because he was saying, like, if more of the Arab world was involved, we would actually have a chance of destroying this whole country, because that's what they want to do. There were riots at one point in like 2005. I think a few people were killed. So they were quite restive even at this point, and they did try to gather arms at different points, and they would fight little low-scale insurgencies against the government until there was eventually a ceasefire in 2010. And I think one of the original Houthi founders was killed as well by the government. But when you get to 2010, 2011, the Arab Spring breaks out. And the Arab Spring broke out in Yemen for similar reasons to most Arab countries. People thought that the leader, Saleh, was very corrupt. He was extending his rule far longer than he was mandated to. When there were protests against him being like corrupt and trying to get his son to inherit the presidency, there were big demonstrations. There was one where police snipers actually just opened fire on demonstrators in the capital, in Sana'a, and killed about 50 people. He eventually, in wake of these protests, lost his legitimacy, and he fled to Saudi Arabia and was replaced by his deputy, a guy called Mansur Hadi, we'll call him. I'm not going to try to pronounce every part of his name. Now, here's the issue, okay? Here's the issue. The Houthis were part of these anti-government protests, okay? They were part of these protests against Saleh. But when Saleh fled and got replaced, and Hadi, his successor, took on a 2-year term, they formed a unity government, and they also tried to engage in reconciliation talks, in a peace process, to try and eventually pave the way for elections that I think were supposed to happen in 2014. Now, the Houthis rejected that because they did not want like a secular, democratic, pro-Western, whatever else, like backed by Saudi Arabia, political environment to take place. They didn't like that. So they actually rejected the reconciliation process. And in 2014, their insurgency massively ramped up, and they eventually ended up defeating the government forces in the capital and in other surrounding areas. Now, what's interesting about 2014 and the Houthi takeover of this area and their eventual expansion down south was that Saleh, the deposed leader from the Arab Spring, had come back. And when the Houthis took over Sana'a, they didn't do it alone. They also did it with help from Saleh. They did it with help from the deposed leader who was trying to come back to reclaim some level of control. Like, So they went against this reconciliation process. They went against the legitimate internationally recognized government that was supposed to replace Saleh. And when Saleh came back, they actually allied with him to try and kick out the legitimate government, and to successfully kick them out in like quite densely populated areas. And they eventually broke off that agreement with Saleh and killed him a few years later. But like that's how the Houthis first started taking over control of the capital and surrounding areas. And then they started pushing further south, and then the Saudis were like, fuck, this is really bad. Like these guys are, and actually already at this stage, a couple of years earlier, Hadi had already been intercepting Iranian weapons imports from the coast that were headed towards the Houthis in 2012. So as soon as Saleh was kicked out, they were already starting to capture Iranian arms from the coast that were directed towards the Houthis. So there was already a threat there of them rising up and trying to take control of their areas. So the Saudis saw this. They saw this threat. They saw this threat of an Iranian armed militant group that was very religiously fundamentalist, very, very aggressive to other Arab states. And we'll get into the ideology in a minute. So they lead an intervention to try and stop this. And that coalition initially includes the Emirates, it includes Sudan, it includes Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Senegal. They're obviously Western backed as well. The UK, the US, Canada, France, South Korea supports them. So the Houthis fight with this coalition and somehow do surprisingly well. They lose territory, but then they start to reclaim it, and they start to lose it, and they start to reclaim it. It goes back and forth over the years. And you end up with the situation currently as it is now, with the Houthis controlling most of the more densely populated parts of the country. And the Saudi effort has basically failed. Now, the fact is that there's not really any good side in this conflict, because obviously the Saudi Arabian government does not abide by international law in many ways, not least of all in war. I think throughout this war, it was estimated that only a third of Saudi strikes actually hit their targets, like military targets. Another third hit civilian sites, and another third just missed completely. So that's the Saudi warfare for you, and the Emirati warfare. And throughout this war as well, the bit that I imagine Hasan would bring up is there was also a blockade. There was a Saudi blockade in 2015 intended to stop arms coming in from Iran, but because it was a Saudi blockade and not, say, like the Israeli blockade, that blockade also, for certain periods, stopped a lot of humanitarian aid from entering. And in 2017, actually, they intensified it to the point that they didn't let anything in at all. In 2017, at the end of the year, they literally tried to block anything, even UN aid. Like everything was blocked in every single port of the country. They lifted that after a month because of pressure from basically everyone. But that blockade contributed to a famine in Yemen. Like of the 400,000 something people who have died in the Yemen civil war, I think about half of those deaths, or maybe more of them, I think it's more of them actually, were said to have been caused by either hunger or healthcare issues. But that's not the only cause of the famine. That's not the only cause. The other cause of the famine, as has been raised by every UN group that has been involved here, as well as just actual video footage, is that the Houthis were stealing aid. Not only were they stealing aid, but they also, at one point, they've been caught by like basically everyone like commandeering hospitals in the middle of fights and shit like that. Yeah, they're pretty gross. And a lot of groups just who were eligible for aid just never received it. I think it was like more than 60% of them. So they've been filmed doing this. Like you can see Houthi guys in trucks that are supposed to be driven by UN people distributing aid, and they're just in there with their guns and like with their fucking sunglasses and celebrate and like laughing and shit. Yeah, so it actually got so bad that at one point the UN even threatened to stop sending aid because they just couldn't find any guarantee that it would go to the people who needed it. This was the UN who actually said they would cut off aid because they just couldn't stop the Houthis from stealing it. And that's not to mention, obviously, like local governance in Yemen is kind of like, it's kind of insane. It's like very lawless in a lot of ways. They don't have like the same kind of observation. So whilst I usually say that the Al-Qassam brigades of Hamas don't really recruit people who are under 18, they'll encourage kids to fight, but they won't conscript them into the actual military. They won't do that usually. Sometimes they do, not usually. It's very rare. The Houthis have no fucking issue with child soldiers. They'll train them. They'll take tens of thousands of kids into these indoctrination centers, teach them how to fight, teach them how to hate Jews and Christians. Actually, teach them how to even hate other ethnic minorities in the area. Teach them women rights are shit and all that. They're really, really bad. And the interesting thing about the Houthis, I didn't know this until even just this morning, because I was reading this today, is that Hussein al-Houthi, over the years, actually published a lot of his speeches and his sermons as a text. It's this 2,000-page document, which is split up into a bunch of smaller books, basically about communicating his ideology, what he stands for, and
event?
Why they do what they do. And would you believe that a lot of this doesn't really have all that much to do with material conditions? Sometimes they'll talk about corruption of the state, because this is all written pre-Civil War, but it's not really just corruption in terms of wealth and inequality. It's corruption in terms of profanity, progressiveness and cultural tolerance. And the big thing that they really don't like about the regime is that they're not fighting with Israel. And they distribute this around Yemen, not just in terms of their education, but also just their general indoctrination. It's this is kind of like the equivalent of their Mao's Little Red Book. And I just want to read you a few parts of this, because I've been looking through trying to Google translate just piecemeal parts of this. This is their position on education system in Yemen. This is part of them talking about the education system under pre-Civil War rule. I'll just read all of it. So he says, when Allah the Almighty said about the Jews, you will surely find the most intense of the people in animosity towards the believers to be the Jews. He wants us to raise ourselves and to raise our children to beat hostility towards the enemies of Allah, to the Jews and the Christians. Enmity in Islam is positive and important. Hostility is positive and important. If you bear hostility towards America and Israel, if the leaders bear hostility and the Muslims bear real hostility, then they will prepare to be at the level of confrontation. However, if there is no real hostility, then they will not prepare anything, and they will have no objection to dealing with the Jews and Christians at the highest level, even to the point of agreements for mutual defense, economic agreements, etc., because there's no hostility. If you are not hostile, you are not preparing yourself to be at the level of confrontation. As Khomeini did in Iran when he established enmity with America and Israel, he worked to make Iran a nation capable of being at the level of confrontation with the West by achieving self-sufficiency. But when these people, he's talking about the regime, I think, worked to erase from the nation feelings of hostility towards the Jews and Christians. Notice it's always Jews and Christians, okay? They moved to make even our strength at their mercy. They humiliated and subjugated us to this degree. What are the curricula that raise our children to bear enmity towards America and Israel, to bear enmity towards the Jews and Christians? Where is the work from any ministry that will make this people at a level that will allow them to withstand even 1 month if they entered a war with Israel? Nothing. Rather, they are affected by and responsive to the demands of Israel, the demands of the Jews. Now, notice how their grievances are not, this is not a grievance of material conditions. This is a country 1,000 miles away from Israel, where this faith leader is upset that his country isn't fighting enough with a country that's 1,000 miles away. And notice when he says the Jews, you have to be careful. In the Middle East, when people say Jews, the Jews, they often just mean Israelis, right? But this does not come from just Israel, okay? That's why they all often refer their justifications to Quranic verses. So here, this is them on Israel. Imam Khomeini was shouting and screaming at all Muslims, urging all Muslims to wake up, to pay attention to the danger looming over them. And he showed that they could, and the Iranian people with their enormous military and economic power could stand with all Muslims, especially the Arab countries, and that if they all stood together, they could strike Israel and end the existence of this usurping entity from within the country. Khomeini is the one who called Israel the cancerous gland. Before the victory of the Islamic Revolution, and the issue of Israel was one of his first concerns during his jihad. When this name was given to Israel, a cancerous gland, it is known that if cancer grows in any human body, the human being must either be able to eliminate and eradicate it, or else it must end that body. It must destabilize that structure in which it grew and flourished. To confirm that Israel is not possible to reconcile with, nor to make peace with, nor to reach an agreement with, nor to conclude any covenants or agreements with. It is a Jewish state. It is a Jewish state that is greedy, not only in Palestine, and not only to dominate a certain area in which it is concentrated, but it aspires to complete domination of the Islamic countries in various fields. It aspires to establish a state for itself from the Nile to the Euphrates, because this is the area that the Jews believe is the land that God wrote for them, and it is the promised land that must be under their control. Again, this is the same as the Hamas Charter, Nile to the Euphrates. Where did this correct vision of Imam Khomeini come from? From the Holy Quran. From the Holy Quran that spoke a lot about the Jews, and from what it said about the Jews, and from what it described them with. Or every time they make a covenant, a party of them threw it aside. Arab countries and all Islamic countries will not be safe from Jews except through their eradication and the elimination of their entity. It's, first of all, that Nile to the Euphrates thing is just anti-Semitic. You can tell it's bullshit because Israel did once have 5,000 settlers in the Sinai, and their very right-wing leader, Menachem Begin, took them out. He pulled them out. They gave up that area. So they're at peace with Egypt. They're not trying to take the Nile. They actually gave up people who were living closer to the Nile. They occupied Lebanon for 18 years, and no one settled there. So just because there are some religious nutcases in Israel who believe this, does not mean that this is that this is, again, what would Hasan would say, something spiritual about the Jews that compels them to do so, because that's the argument he's making. I'll probably get a few more bits from this. I want to read through more of this once I get like a proper translate of it, because I've only been translating this piecemeal so far. It's quite long. But this is the kind of shit that they're teaching just to like fucking young teenagers in Yemen as part of their indoctrination process. So it's quite wacky, okay? This is and the reason I bring this up is that when you read this kind of like opinions that they have, especially over the Jews, it's like this is the book that they circulate around Yemen. It's like their Mao's little red book. It's like their foundational doctrine. This is their Anne Frank's diary, just so you know. It's really, it's bizarre. So I don't really know why these guys with a Islamic fundamentalist hatred of, again, not just Israel, but the Jews. Like, that's why their slogan is death to Israel, death to America, and a curse upon the Jews. Like, they hate the Jews so much that they mention them twice. And their shitty views on women, and how the fact that, like, again, they've literally been filmed like raiding schools where women are trying to get an education, or where they're stealing humanitarian aid to the point that aid organizations don't even think it's worth sending aid to particular parts of the country anymore, where they literally contributed to a famine. The fact that they brought back slavery at one point. Yeah, they were literally like detaining arbitrarily and enslaving people who refugees who came from Ethiopia into Yemen. But I don't know, I just thought I want to give you a bit of context, because I know Hasan never actually elaborates on why he thinks wait, what the fuck is this? Anyway, I know Hasan never likes to elaborate on why he thinks the Houthis are just Anne Franks who are resisting genocide or whatever else. But just to give you that context, that that's what he defends about why there's a war in Yemen. And also, that's also why, just so you know, people never actually typically call what's happening in Yemen a genocide. That's why it's typically not been described in those words, even by like professionals. Like it's that for all the fucking like horrors of the Saudi military and the Emirati military as well, the Houthis are war criminals themselves. Like that famine is not just because of the Saudi blockade. It's also because of how the Houthis reacted to that blockade. It's because they literally stole aid and kept it away from people and left them to starve. And not even to mention their treatment of the last remaining Jews in Yemen as well. That was a whole thing about how they were persecuted by the Houthis in the area and other religious minorities as well. Oh, there was that one. Oh, what was this one? It was is it pronounced Baha'i? That religious minority? This is like a religious group in Yemen, and their entire shtick is that they basically believe that they kind of see themselves like almost like an amalgamation of all the other like monotheistic and Abrahamic religions, something like that. At least that's how they're characterized. And the Ayatollah in 2013 issued out a fatwa against them, saying that people should basically like never engage with them, that they're treacherous, that they're not to be trusted. And in Yemen, a lot of them were imprisoned and tortured because they were accused of being spies. And there's this one tweet that I found of I think he's just like a Yemeni activist. Yeah, I think he's just an activist, but he described them as satanic. Also, a couple of like leaders did that as well, and was saying that they should be flayed. That was one of the things that he said about them. Where's that tweet? Yeah, this guy, the activist. I don't know how big this guy is. He's only got like 30,000 followers, but he sells himself as a Houthi activist, saying that the Baha'i were a satanic religion and that every one of them will be flayed. Amnesty decries Houthi persecution of Baha'is in Yemen. This is from September 18. What year is this? 2018. Legitimate government fled the country, campaign against political and religious opponents, held thousands of detention where torture is rampant. The Houthi group's leader has targeted Baha'is in public speeches, describing them as satanic. Several have been detained, tortured, and held incommunicado, according to the UN representative from the community. So, again, I don't know what Anne Frank was doing in that attic or wherever the fuck she was hiding. I don't know if she was supporting that shit. Not too sure about that. Why would Israeli bombs do this? I don't know. Couldn't tell you. But there you go. Just because Hasan won't tell you. And again, like Yemeni history is it's incredibly difficult to get a grasp on because there's just so much factionalism. But just to give you some impression of what was happening there, because it's so shit that like, again, you've got hundreds of thousands of people and you have their ear and you're out here justifying like some of the most atrocious criminals in the entire fucking world, like some of the most gross bigotry and violation of human rights. And you're just like, not only are you trying to excuse it or put it into context or anything like that, you know, like there is a context to explain where the Houthis came from and why they're doing what they're doing. It's not just like because they're just randomly evil people. Like the issues with Yemen, you can go back thousands of years to talk about why that came about and the failures of other countries. But it's not that he does any of that. He doesn't contextualize or anything like that. He glazes it. He likes it. It makes him really happy, describing them as musically gifted people. Oh, God. But since he's never going to actually elaborate on what the Houthis have done in Yemen since in the last 10 years, then... Oh, yeah, it was also this one. This one's been making the rounds as well. The execution that we will carry out on all Zionists. Come on, man. The fuck. Taken straight out of Anne Frank's diary. It's also so fucking mental that Hasan has just assumed that this is a one-sided conflict and that this guy has been on the receiving end of genocide. How do we know this guy is not like... How do we know this guy hasn't benefited from Houthi fucking conquest in the area, like from Houthis taking over areas? Like, why would you assume that? Like, Houthis have won battles in Yemen. They've pushed back. They were the ones who deposed the legitimate, recognized government in the area. How do we know he hasn't benefited from them stealing aid or enslaving people or whatever the fuck else? Or giving him a job, apparently, as a propagandist? You're glazing the Yemeni government. No, I'm not. I've said a million times the Yemeni government was not fucking good, Sundowner. Shut the fuck up. That is not glazing. It's just interesting that that the old government, Saleh, who was literally deposed by the Arab Spring, that the Houthis allied with them to get to make their first claims on the capital. He also said he's chilled with the Saudis and went there for weddings. Not sure Anne Frank would have done that in the 40s. We're getting a bit too literal now, though, aren't we? What are the chances the Houthi kid doesn't even believe what happened to Anne Frank? Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, there's a mirror in the comments. Always, always.
We're not like, oh, you're trans. We're not like, oh, you're trans. We're going to kill you. They were like, oh, thank you for your fucking humanitarian aid. They don't give a shit. Like, it's the same as any other kind of person. I talked to a teenager from Yemen, okay, who everyone called, myself included, called Timothy Charlemagne or Chalamet.
Is that the One Piece one?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now this kid is like, I think he was like 19 at the time when I talked to him, which means that for most of his life he has withstood genocide, right?
Sure.
Like he is a person whose only experience is like, it's literally like talking to fucking Anne Frank, basically. Okay, being able to talk to Anne Frank in real time. That's all he's known is death and destruction of his home.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
With
but he's
American
not getting killed by gay people, right? He's not getting killed. Like if he's talking.
No. Oh no. This must be AI, right? No, he said that. He said it. He did it. He did the thing.